Some stories were never meant to be heard. Until now, you're listening to War Tape Files.
The rain wasn't falling, it was detonating against the mud. MSG Jax Miller, callsign Anvil-11, pressed his face into the saturated earth as a burst of 7.62 millimeters shredded the rotted log 3 inches above his cranium. The air smelled of ozone, burnt cordite, and the metallic tang of blood that refused to clot in the humidity. Behind him, the rhythmic, wet coughs of his RTO told him everything he needed to know about their status. They were bleeding out in a bowl of jagged limestone and shadows. "Paladin, this is Anvil-11, how copy?" Miller roared into the handheld, his thumb white-knuckled on the PTT. Static clawed back at him, a jagged wall of white noise fueled by the superstorm screaming through the valley. "We have 3 Cat A casualties. We are Winchester on 40 millimeter. The EKIA count is climbing and the perimeter is collapsing. Requesting immediate case vac at grid Alpha 9er0. How copy?" 1,000 miles away, or maybe just a few ridges over, it felt the same. The voice of a TOC controller crackled through the interference. It was cold, it was clinical, it was a death sentence. "Anvil-11, Paladin, solid copy on your sit rep. Be advised the AO is declared red. Weather minimums are exceeded. ISR assets have been scrubbed due to high-altitude turbulence. No bird is turning blades in this soup. Negative on extraction. Establish a defensive CCP and prep for E&E. Over." "E&E?" Miller spat a mixture of grit and bile. "Paladin, I have 3 leaders on litters. We aren't walking anywhere. We need a lift or we're going to be a footnote by sunrise. Send the heavies. Send anything with a rotor." "Negative, Anvil. Command has scrubbed all sorties. You are outside the envelope. Maintain ComSec and wait for a window. Paladin out." The radio went dead. Miller looked at his team. They were ghosts already, illuminated by the sickly green flicker of a dying IR strobe. 5 miles out, buffered by the reinforced concrete of the Tactical Operations Center at Forward Operating Base FOB Grizzly, CW3 Elias Thorne leaned against a rack of flight helmets. He wasn't on the clock. He was supposed to be in his rack, trying to quiet the tremor in his left hand. Instead, he was patched into the long-range net, listening to the slow-motion car crash of Anvil-11's final stand. He clicked the fingers of his flight gloves, click, 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 a nervous metronome. On the monitors lining the wall, the weather overlay was a bruised purple mass of no-go parameters, wind shears at 80 knots, visibility near 0, and then there was the threat ring, the glowing red circles indicating active SA-18 manpad sites littered across the ridgeline. "He's gonna leave them," Thorne whispered. "Thorne, back off," the duty officer snapped, eyes glued to a different screen. "The Colonel made the call. The risk to mission exceeds the gain. We aren't losing an airframe and a crew for a botched hit. It's a math problem now, Spectre, and the math says they're gone." Thorne looked at his helmet resting on the bench. The faded spade hand painted on the Kevlar shell seemed to mock him. He could feel the phantom vibration of a GE T700 engine in his boots. To the brass, it was a math problem. To the guys in the mud, it was the sound of the dirt being shoveled over their heads. He looked at his left hand. It was shaking. He clenched it into a fist until the knuckles turned white, the old nerve damage screaming under the pressure. In the TOC, the officers were already moving on to the morning briefing, turning their backs on the static coming from the valley. The Broken Arrow call was still echoing in the room, but the room had decided not to hear it. Thorne grabbed his flight bag. He didn't have an order. He didn't have a co-pilot. He didn't even have a fueled bird. But he had a frequency, and he had a debt to the guys who didn't get to say negative. Outside, the storm shrieked, a mechanical beast demanding a sacrifice. Thorne stepped into the rain, his eyes fixed on the darkened hangars where Spectre 6-4, a Black Hawk with a leaky hydraulic line and a bad attitude, sat waiting in the dark. The maintenance hangar was a cavern of corrugated steel and dying echoes. Outside, the storm pounded the roof with the rhythmic violence of a heavy machine gun, but inside, the air was stagnant, smelling of hydraulic fluid and cold grease. CW3 Elias Thorne moved like a shadow through the rows of parked airframes. His left hand was tucked deep into his flight suit pocket, fingers clawing at his palm to stay the tremors. He stopped in front of airframe 742, Spectre 6-4. She was a battered UH-60M Blackhawk, her skin a mosaic of mismatched olive-drab panels and carbon scoring from a previous deployment in the Kunar. A yellow maintenance status tag dangled from the pitot tube like a toe tag in a morgue. Hydraulic line 2, intermittent pressure drops. Fuel sensor 1, non-functional. "Just you and me, girl," Thorne whispered, his voice swallowed by the thunder. "Nobody else is dumb enough to fly tonight." He didn't use a flashlight. He knew the pre-flight by heart, by touch, by the way the rivets felt against his calloused fingertips. He climbed into the cockpit, the familiar scent of old sweat and ionized dust greeting him. He settled into the armored seat, the faded spade helmet clicking into place on his head. On the center console, his ruggedized tablet blinked. A direct order from the wing commander sat pinned to the top of the display. All rotary assets grounded. Return to billeting immediately. Thorne stared at the text for a heartbeat. He thought about Miller, 5 miles away, probably counting his last rounds and wondering why the sky was empty. With a steady right hand, Thorne swiped the notification into the trash. Delete. The startup sequence was a symphony of mechanical defiance. Battery, on. The glass cockpit flickered to life, casting a ghostly green glow over his tired features. The warning lights for the fuel sensor and hydraulics immediately began their frantic amber dance. Thorne ignored them. APU, start. Deep in the belly of the beast, a small turbine whined to life, a high-pitched scream that cut through the roar of the rain. The airframe began to vibrate, a low-frequency hum that synced with the thrumming in Thorne's own chest. He felt the adrenaline hit his system, the chemical surge finally stilling the nerves in his left hand. For the first time in months, his fingers were rock steady. He reached up to the overhead panel, flipping the fuel selectors to DIR. "Engine 1, engage." The starter motor groaned. The main rotor blades overhead began to groan as they fought against the drag of the torrential rain. Thump, thump, thump. The slow, heavy rotation gained speed until the centrifugal force started to pull at the airframe. "Spectre 6-4, this is Grizzly Ground," a startled voice crackled in his headset. The tower had seen the heat signature. "Identify yourself. You do not have clearance for engine start. Terminate immediately. Over." Thorne didn't key the mic. He didn't want to hear their excuses again. He slammed the throttle for engine 2 into the fly position. The twin T-700 engines roared in unison, a wall of sound that shook the hangar floor. The torque needles climbed into the green, then dipped into the yellow as the malfunctioning sensor struggled to find the truth. "Spectre 6-4, cease operations. You are in violation of a direct order. Military police are en route to your hangar. Acknowledge." Thorne looked out through the rain-streaked windscreen. The hangar doors were open just enough. He pulled the collective, feeling the bird get light on its wheels. The hydraulic pressure gauge for line 2 flickered, the needle dropping toward the red fail zone before bouncing back like a dying man's pulse. "Tower, this is Spectre 6-4, Thorne finally spoke, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "I have a mechanical discrepancy. I'm taking her out for a ground taxi check. Commencing repositioning now." "Negative, Spectre. Stay on the pad. That's an illegal—" Thorne cut the comms. He kicked the left anti-torque pedal, swinging the tail around. The Blackhawk skidded across the wet concrete, rotors screaming as they bit into the thick, humid air. He pushed the cyclic forward, nosediving into the darkness before the MP vehicles could even clear the perimeter. He wasn't just flying a mission anymore. He was a ghost in the machine, heading into the mouth of a storm that the god of war himself had declared impassable. The transition from the lit hangar to the abyss of the valley was like being blindfolded and thrown into a centrifuge. Thorne had the Blackhawk at 50 feet AGL, above ground level, contour flying the jagged topography of the Devil's Throat, a canyon so narrow it didn't exist on most civilian maps. This was nap of the Earth flight taken to a suicidal extreme. Through his AN/PVS-31 night vision goggles, the world was a grainy, high-contrast nightmare of sickly phosphorus green. The rain didn't look like water, it looked like glowing needles of light trying to pierce his windscreen. "Come on, you beautiful disaster," Thorne gritted his teeth, his boots dancing on the anti-torque pedals. The turbulence was physical, a series of violent, invisible hands slamming against the airframe. The Black Hawk groaned, the structural rivets screaming as the 80-knot crosswinds tried to roll the bird into the canyon walls. Every time the wind sheared, the hydraulic pressure in line 2 plummeted. The cyclic, the stick that controlled his pitch and roll, became sluggish, then suddenly stiff like trying to stir concrete with a spoon. "Master caution!" The red light bathed the cockpit in the emergency red of the mood board, reflecting off the salt and pepper stubble in Thorne's jaw. The HUD, heads-up display, projected a frantic strobe of warnings across his vision. "Hydric pump 2 fail. Low fuel. Radar altitude critical." I know, Thorne growled at the dashboard. He reached out with a steady left hand and flicked the master caution reset. He didn't need the computer to tell him he was dying. He could feel it in the vibrations of the floorboards. The smell hit him then. The sweet, cloying scent of atomized hydraulic fluid. It was leaking into the cabin air. It meant the leak wasn't just a drip anymore, it was a spray. If that fluid hit a hot engine component, Spectre 6-4 wouldn't just crash, it would become a meteor. Suddenly, the green world of his NVGs lit up with a terrifying white-hot brilliance. Thump, 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 thump. Tracers, Thorne hissed. From the ridgeline above, a ZU-23-2 anti-aircraft battery opened up. They couldn't see him on radar this low, but they could hear the rhythmic thumb of the GE engines echoing off the limestone. They were firing blind into the canyon, a curtain of high-explosive incendiary rounds raining down. The shells streaked past the cockpit, bright, angry tears in the fabric of the night. Thorne pulled the collective, dumping torque into the rotor system. The bird lurched, a gut-wrenching climb that sent a spike of white noise through the radio. Anvil 1-1, this is Spectre 6-4. We hear you. We hear your blades, man. Tell me that's you. Miller's voice was barely audible over the screech of the wind and the crackle of small arms fire. Anvil, this is Spectre, Thorne shouted, fighting the cyclic as a gust of wind tried to shove him into a rock face. I'm in the pipe, 2 minutes out. I've got a twitchy bird and a hot LZ. Prep your wounded. I'm only going to have one shot at this pinnacle landing. How's your perimeter? Perimeter is gone, Spectre. We're inside the CCP. They're coming up the east slope. If you don't put it down in 60 seconds, don't bother coming at all. Thorne saw the hot LZ ahead, a tiny, jagged plateau illuminated by the flickering orange glow of burning supply crates. It looked like a postage stamp on the side of a mountain. To land there, he'd have to perform a pinnacle, landing only the front wheels while hovering the tail over a 1,000-foot drop. The hydraulic warning screamed again. The stick went completely dead for a terrifying half-second. The Black Hawk dipped its nose, the rotors clipping the top of a scorched pine tree with a sound like a gunshot. Crack. Not today, Thorne whispered, his adrenaline finally overriding the nerve damage. His left hand fused to the controls. He pushed the engines into the over-torque range. The mechanical heartbeat of the rotors accelerated, thump, 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 becoming a continuous roar. He wasn't flying a helicopter anymore. He was wearing it. He ignored the failing sensors, the empty fuel gauge, and the tracers stitching the air around him. He focused on the single blinking IR strobe on the ground, the heartbeat of the men he refused to abandon. He flared the bird, the nose coming up high to bleed off airspeed, the tail rotor swinging out over the abyss. The midnight storm reached its crescendo as he descended into the fire. To MSG Jax Miller, the world had shrunk to the size of a rifle sight and the length of a mud-slicked trench. His M4 was hot, the handguard searing through his gloves as he dumped another magazine into the tree line. The muzzle flashes of the enemy were closing in, a jagged circle of fire tightening around his wounded. Then he heard it. It wasn't a mechanical sound at first, it was a pressure in the chest, a rhythmic thrumming that vibrated the very marrow of his bones. Through the curtain of rain and the screaming wind, a shadow materialized. It didn't look like a machine, it looked like a prehistoric predator emerging from the charcoal mist. Spectre 6-4 roared over the ridge, the downdraft of the massive rotors hitting the LZ like a physical blow, flattening the grass and sending debris flying in a lethal spray. "He's here!" Miller screamed over the comms, though the words were lost in the thunder. "Move! Move! Litters to the door!" Thorne didn't land. He couldn't. The plateau was a jagged tooth of rock with no room for a full footprint. He performed a pinnacle landing, a maneuver that required the precision of a surgeon and the nerves of a dead man. He eased the nose wheels onto the edge of the limestone shelf, keeping the tail rotor hovering in the empty air over the 1,000-foot drop. The Black Hawk groaned, the airframe twisting under the uneven torque. "Loading! Loading!" Miller yelled, dragging a wounded specialist toward the open cabin door. Inside the cockpit, Thorne was fighting a losing battle with the physics of flight. The hydraulic pressure in line 2 flatlined. The cyclic stick in his right hand began to vibrate with a violent bone-shaking frequency, the death shiver of a failing rotor head. "Come on, Elias, hold it, hold the line," Thorne hissed, his left hand clamped onto the collective like a vice. His vision was a chaotic smear of phosphorus green and emergency red. Tracers from the tree line began to stitch across the helicopter's belly, the metallic ping, ping, ping of lead hitting the skin, sounding like hammers on a tin roof. A round shattered the chin bubble, the glass floor near Thorne's feet. Shards of acrylic sprayed his flight suit. A second later, a spark erupted from the center console. The smell of burning insulation joined the cloying scent of hydraulic fluid. "Anvil, you're taking fire from the 6. Get in, now!" Thorne roared into the mic, his eyes darting to the torque gauge. It was redlining. The engines were screaming in protest, sucking in the rain-heavy air and spitting out blue flame. Miller threw the last man into the cabin. He looked back at the tree line, seeing the dark shapes of the enemy breaking cover, barely 20 meters away. He pulled his last thermal detonator, his thumb hovering over the pin. "Go! Spectre, pull us out!" Miller scrambled into the cabin, his boots slipping on a mix of rainwater and blood. "Clear! Clear! Clear!" Thorne didn't wait for the confirmation to settle. He yanked the collective. The Black Hawk didn't lift, it stumbled. With the hydraulic lines severed, the rotor blades weren't pitching correctly. The bird lurched sideways, the tail rotor swinging dangerously close to the rock face. Thorne slammed the anti-torque pedal, his bad hand screaming in pain as he forced the cyclic to the left. "Don't you quit on me!" he screamed at the machine. For a heartbeat, the helicopter hung suspended between the cliff and the abyss, gravity clawing at the 10-ton beast. Then the turbines found a desperate breath of air. The mechanical heartbeat surged into a deafening roar. Spectre 6-4 clawed its way upward, banking hard into the storm, just as a rocket-propelled grenade streaked through the space where the cockpit had been a second before. They were airborne, but they weren't safe. The cabin was a triage center of screams and heavy breathing. Behind them, the LZ vanished into the dark, lit only by the final, defiant explosion of Miller's detonator. Thorne looked at his gauges. The fuel sensor was dead. The hydraulic pressure was gone. He was flying on nothing but aerodynamic memory and pure, unadulterated spite. "Paladin, this is Spectre 6-4, Thorne transmitted, his voice eerily calm amidst the chaos. "I have Anvil 1-1 on board. We are RTB. Tell the MPs to have the coffee ready. We're coming in heavy and we're coming in hot." The radio remained silent. Command didn't answer, but in the back of the bird, Miller leaned his head against the vibrating bulkhead and closed his eyes. The ghost had come for them. The dawn didn't break over FOB Grizzly. It bled through the clouds in bruised shades of gray and sickly violet. Spectre 6-4 didn't fly back so much as it drifted on a wing in a prayer. The GET 700 engines weren't roaring anymore. They were wheezing, a rhythmic, metallic cough that signaled the final drops of JP-8 were being sucked from the bottom of the tanks. Thorne sat like a stone statue in the pilot's seat, his flight suit soaked in a mixture of his own sweat and the green hydraulic fluid that had misted the cockpit. His left hand was dead still now, not because the tremor was gone, but because he was holding the collective with a grip that had turned his knuckles into white marble. "Spectre 6-4, you are on a glide path to runway 20, a voice crackled in his headset. It wasn't the frantic tower controller from an hour ago. It was a cold, formal tone, the tone of a court-martial in the making. "Emergency services are on standby. Armed security detail is in position at pad 4. Do not, repeat, do not exit the aircraft until instructed." Thorne didn't respond. He didn't have the breath left. He looked out the shattered chin bubble at the base below. The landing lights of the FOB looked like tiny, uncaring stars. "Bingo fuel," Thorne whispered, the warning light finally turning from a flicker to a solid terminal red. The engines flamed out just as he cleared the perimeter wire. The sudden silence was more terrifying than the storm had ever been. It was the sound of gravity reclaiming its debt. Thorne flared the bird one last time, using the residual inertia of the rotor blades, the dead man's curve, to cushion the fall. The Black Hawk hit pad 4 with a bone-jarring slam. The landing gear groaned, the left strut snapping under the pressure of the uneven load. The bird tilted, the rotors clipping the concrete with a series of thunderous metal-shredding cracks before the system finally ground to a screeching halt. Silence. Then the world exploded into motion. Emergency sirens wailed. Red and blue strobes from military police Humvees cut through the morning mist. Thorne sat in the cockpit, hands finally dropping from the controls. He watched through the spider-webbed windscreen as the side doors slid open. Medics swarmed the cabin, pulling the litters out with practiced, frantic efficiency. He saw Jax Miller leap out, his face a mask of mud and exhaustion, helping the medics carry the men he'd refused to leave behind. Miller stopped. He turned back toward the cockpit, his eyes meeting Thorne's through the glass. He didn't salute, that would have been too formal for the mud they'd just crawled out of. He just nodded, a slow, heavy acknowledgement of a life debt. The cockpit door was yanked open from the outside. "CW3 Thorne, hands where I can see them." It was the provost marshal, backed by 4 MPs with M4s at the low ready. Behind them stood the wing commander, his face a mask of cold, bureaucratic fury. Thorne moved slowly. He unclipped his faded spade helmet and set it on the center console, right over the burnt-out fuel sensor. He stood up, his legs shaking, and stepped out onto the wet concrete. The air felt unnaturally still. "Elias Thorne," the commander said, his voice low and dangerous, "you bypassed a direct command. You stole a multi-million-dollar airframe. You violated every ROE and safety protocol in the book. You're done. You'll never see the inside of a cockpit again." Thorne didn't look at the colonel. He looked at the medevac bird taking off in the distance, carrying Miller's men to the surgical theater. He felt the weight of the wings pinned to his chest, the silver insignia he'd spent half a decade earning. "Sir," Thorne said, his voice raspy but clear, "the math was wrong." He reached up, unpinning the silver aviator wings from his flight suit. His left hand gave one final sharp tremor as he held them out. But it wasn't Miller he handed them to. As Miller approached, breaking through the MP line despite their protests, Thorne pressed the wings into the Master Sergeant's rough, blood-stained palm. "Keep 'em. I won't be needing them where I'm going." The MPs moved in. The metallic click-clack of handcuffs was the final sound of the mission. As they led Thorne away toward the waiting Humvee, Miller stood on the tarmac, clutching the silver wings. The sun finally broke through the clouds, hitting the wreckage of Spectre 6-4. The bird was a ruin, leaking, broken, and gray, but as the ghost pilot was driven off the flight line, the men on the litters were breathing. The price was paid. The debt was settled.
This concludes today's entry in the War Tape Files. History is written in the records we leave behind. To help us preserve more of these stories, subscribe and join our archive. Thank you for watching.